Welcome once again to Holy Cross Abbey, Benedictine Monastery in Kilbroney Valley, Rostrevor, County Down. We've journeyed together during these Lenten days, and now we enter into the great Holy Week. I would like to begin the reflection for this Monday of Holy Week by reading from the Gospel passage that's proposed for the day. And the opening line of the Gospel makes it very clear why it's the Gospel that's appropriate for this day. 6 days before the Passover, Jesus went to Bethany, where Lazarus was, whom he had raised from the dead. They gave a dinner for him there. Martha waited them, and Lazarus was among those at table. Mary brought in a pound of very costly ointment, pure nard, and with it she anointed the feet of Jesus, wiping them with her hair. The house was full of the scent of the ointment. Then Judas Iscariot, one of the disciples, the man who was to betray him, said, "Why wasn't this ointment sold for 300 denarii and the money given to the poor?" He said this not because he cared for the poor, but because he was a thief. He was in charge of the common fund and used to help himself to the contributions. So Jesus said, "Leave her alone. She had to keep this scent for the day of my burial. You have the poor with you always. You will not always have me." What a contrast between Mary and Judas in that Gospel passage. With Mary, what we witness is a display of extravagant love. She doesn't calculate. She doesn't count the cost involved in her loving gesture. We could really say it's the folly of love that gives without counting the cost. She willingly wastes the expensive ointment, and she uses it to anoint Jesus' feet. There's absolutely no self-interest in Mary's gesture. Her whole attention is given to Christ. He is her entire focus. We think of those words of the prophet, how beautiful the feet of those who carry the good news. She has recognized that this man Jesus has been the one who has carried the good news, and his feet are beautiful and they deserve to be anointed. This approach stands in line with Mary's consistent attitude of attention in regard to Jesus in all the Gospel accounts in which she figures. The Gospels are punctuated with scenes wherein we see Mary display respectful consideration for Jesus. A respectful consideration so clearly infused with love. I think of 3 Gospel records of scenes in which we see Mary kneel before the Master in humble love. And there's a 4th scene, of course, a post-resurrection scene, her encounter with the risen Christ, that also comes to mind. In Luke 10, she is shown to have sat at Jesus' feet, listening to every word that fell from his mouth. As she gave him her full attention, Martha was in the kitchen complaining, "What's she doing? Only sitting there listening. There's work to be done." But there again we see that the full focus of Mary's attention was Jesus. Maybe we ourselves have held ourselves in that kind of posture at the feet of someone we have loved. They've been sitting on the settee, for example, and we've sat on the floor beside them. A way of being close to them. But a way of being close to them that explains or expresses that we situate ourselves before them in real humility. Or maybe another person has done that in our regard. And then there's that other scene that comes to mind, and we find it in John's Gospel in chapter 11, where Mary is shown to have thrown herself at Jesus' feet. In that scene, she is crying. She is seeking comfort. Jesus has arrived on the scene after the death of her brother Lazarus. And we read in John 11, when Mary arrived where Jesus was, she fell down at his feet. Here it was a pleading. a confident trust that Mary displayed. And her kneeling gesture translated the virtue of hope. The first scene is the virtue of love. Here's the virtue of hope. Hope born of the assurance she held in her heart that the Master, who loved her and her family and cared for them in their loss, would do something to alleviate their pain. And then we have the gospel scene that I read for you from John chapter 12. That passage we read makes it clear for us all that Mary's abundance of heart reaches out to Jesus. It is a gesture of extravagant love made manifest. And the text conveys the sweetness that surrounded Mary's gesture. We read, the fragrance of the ointment filled the house. We can nearly smell the fragrance of that ointment. We can nearly savour the scene that we read in that gospel text. We are, as it were, caught into the love that was displayed in Mary's loving, caring gesture. Reading this gospel scene, a scene in my own life comes back to mind in a very different setting. It was in an Indian restaurant found here in Northern Ireland. A couple who were very evidently in love were with each other, seated at table, in what was a fairly packed restaurant. And it's not as if they were behaving in a way that drew particular attention to themselves. They were really quite restrained and discreet, but there was a glow about them. There was a certain aura, we could say, in the air, an aura around them. And I remember the waiter coming along as he approached them, and I observed that a beautiful smile came over his face. And quite spontaneously, to everyone's surprise, he described what he saw played out before his eyes. And I can still hear his exclamation with his Indian accent, not just addressed to the couple, but to the people sitting around. He said, "So much love." There, sitting nearby in that restaurant that evening, I found that I began to smile as well. Before long, we were all rejoicing to see displayed before our eyes the gracious blessing of love shared between two people, that man and that woman. So much for what I witnessed in that restaurant that evening many years ago. Monks don't normally go to restaurants, so perhaps that's why the story stays with me so clearly. But I think more than that, it's really that exclamation of so much love, and that awakening within my own heart to see, yes, that's what I see lived out before me. Anyway, let's come back to our gospel story. When we come back to our gospel story, we see that not everyone is smiling. Not everyone is happy. And Judas certainly isn't like that Indian waiter in that restaurant in County Antrim. Judas is evidently disgruntled by what he sees lived out before him. He is annoyed. So we have a real contrast between this extravagant, abundant love manifested by Mary and this kind of stingy attitude of heart that we find in Judas. Judas comes across as someone who is one step removed from what is going on. He's not like that waiter who was able to enter into what was being lived by the couple and was able to get all of us gathered around to enter into it. It's as if Judas looks on at the scene from outside, totally outside, and with a sadness. He holds himself at a distance. He really isn't there in a way. He isn't part of what's going on. He refuses to be caught into the circle of love. The waiter in my restaurant and those around him did allow themselves to be caught into the circle of love. That's why they smiled. That's why they felt happy. There is no sweet fragrance exuding from Judas, only bitter anger and jealousy, harsh judgment and vicious envy. There is no joy around Judas. We can feel only sadness, a tristesse, a heaviness as we look on. Whereas Mary herself showed such extravagant love in her gesture, such self-giving, such uncalculating love, Judas showed himself to be a calculating person, one driven by self-interest. And there's something tragic about that way of situating oneself. Tragic about Judas, and there can be a tragedy in regard to ourselves too. Judas is someone who journeyed with Jesus for quite some time as his close companion, and yet it is as if we are shown here in this scene that he still had not understood anything. And we can journey with Jesus for many years and perhaps still not fully understand, maybe not understand anything at all. Judas had been close to Jesus, and yet he had not really got it. He had not really grasped who Jesus was. He had not really known the Master. How could this be so? I wonder if it's not due to the fact that Judas was someone who was very wrapped up in himself. So wrapped up in himself there was no room for any other, not even Jesus. In the story, it's made clear that the bottom line for Judas was profit. He was looking for a way to gain something and to retain it for himself. He had evidently approached his relationship with Jesus over the years with this question in his heart: what is in this relationship for me? What am I going to get out of it? What's it going to yield? And at the point where we meet him in the gospel story I read, Judas is disappointed by Jesus. And his betrayal stems from his sense of disappointment. In following Jesus, Judas thought that he was on a sure road for political and financial success. Indeed, he was excited about the role he would have in the kingdom that Jesus would set up. When faced with the reality of Jesus' approaching death and sacrifice, when faced with the reality of impoverishment, humiliation, smallness and simplicity, Judas's hopes and expectations of self-aggrandissement caved in, they were dashed. If the Mary scene brought back to me that memory of my restaurant experience I shared with you, I can think of other situations and people who are brought back to mind as I think of Judas in the scene. I can think of situations of people who are bitter and who are envious and who are sad because of that. If joy is brought back to my heart as I think of the restaurant scene I assisted at, there is a sadness awakened within me when I have those memories of people who are like Judas. The real sadness is probably most around the proper self-awareness that people should have in their hearts. And that should help them realize that we are all of us loved. If only Judas had recognized how much Jesus loved him, then he wouldn't have been caught into that attitude that was destructive for his life. And so we pray for the grace to recognize, as Mary was able to recognize so much love, how much Jesus loved her. We pray for the grace to recognize that even when we struggle to see others receive the Lord's favor, he loves us too. And if we were able to do that, then we wouldn't fall into the trap of Judas, who spoiled it all for himself in the end. And so, Lord, we pray, give us that generosity of heart that allows us to give our all for you, and remove from us that tendency, that little Judas tendency that can be there within each one of us, to be somewhat stingy and bitter and resentful. Amen.
Sanctus, Sanctus, Sanctus Dominus, Deus Sabaoth, plenis ut celi et terra, gloria tua.
The work of Shalom is an essential part and a powerful part of the work of evangelization, of promoting the objective of sharing the good news of the gospel, the joy of the good news of the gospel and its promise of salvation in this life and beyond death in the new life of the risen Lord. Its evangelization of culture and civilization is a most important objective for the people of God and the Church right around the world. In this 21st century, when the human family is battered by so many forces of change, of uncertainty, forces which seem to threaten and menace hope, the hope of the risen Christ and of the good news of the gospel is something which has to be shared not only between individuals, but with communities of peoples right around the nations of God's earth. May the Lord bestow his blessing on the work of Shalom, on all who are associated with it, and also indeed on all those who through their charity and kindness support its most important work.